Our presentation is on invasive species and effects of biodiversity. I'm Kavika Fuelis.
I'm Nicholas Huff.
I'm Solomon Hilton.
I'm Lauren Owens.
I'm Jessica Stafford.
And I'm Brittany Troxel.
So our outline for our group involves 15 topics, excluding the references. Just to name a few, what is an invasive species, what is biodiversity, solution impacts on Great Lakes, and negative effects on the invasive species.
All right, and then first of all, what is an invasive species? So basically, it's any organism that is introduced to a new environment and it causes economic harm, and it can reproduce quickly, and it is very aggressive, and it alters the natural resources in the area and can affect the resources used by humans. Also, 42% of at-risk or endangered species are at risk because of invasive species. So they cause a lot of harm and they cause a big decline in the species that are native to that environment. So just to name a few examples of some invasive species, they range from bacteria and fungus to plants and animals. So we have the brown marmorated stink bug, zebra mussels, Kogon grass, and Dutch elm disease. So that's just a few to name for examples.
Hemlock is a specific type of species. These insects move from Asia to the east coast of the United States, where they infest hemlock trees. The presence of these insects can be identified by the white mass as seen in the picture. The white is a woolly mass that these insects make when they latch onto the trees. And once this species latches onto the tree, they will remain in this spot for the rest of their life. So they take starch from this tree, and the presence of this insect will cause an interruption in the nutrient flow in the branches, and this will ultimately lead to the declining in health of the tree and its death. Hemlock trees are important for animals such as mooses and black bears. So with these habitats being destroyed, the animals that rely on them will lose their resources and can ultimately go towards extinction.
And then invasive species spread very quickly, and there's a few ways that they spread, but the most common way is through human activities. So with boats, aquatic organisms can attach themselves to the propellers of smaller boats, and they can also get in the ship's ballast water. When they travel from area to area, they get released from their initial area into the new area that they reach. Also, with shipping pallets, insects and smaller organisms can attach themselves to any kind of shipping material that we use to ship from one area to another. So that's another way that they can travel. Another common way that invasive species spread is through environmental changes. So if temperatures rise, the species will move to an area that has the temperatures that they need to survive, as well as changes in rain and snow patterns. If those patterns change to a point where the organisms won't be able to survive, they'll move to an area that has the right patterns for them. And then stopping the spread of invasive species is through additional human activity. So we have a few examples here. Don't let it loose. Don't release animals into different environments that they are native to. So especially some aquariums and some fish bait that you're using, don't just dump that into a convenient waterway for you. Go ahead and put that in the trash. Also clean, drain, and dry, especially for water recreational vehicles such as boats and jet skis. Go ahead and clean those off at the lake or wherever you're using them before transferring them, because aquatic organisms can attach themselves to those. Also, washing your vehicles, especially if you go off-roading, washing your vehicles can keep those species that may get into the tires or the undercarriage. They can keep them from traveling wherever your vehicle goes. Shaking out your tent and other camping equipment. If you go ahead and shake that out before you leave the campsite, that will keep those invasive species that got into your equipment, that'll keep them there instead of spreading them with you. Washing your pets, especially if they like to roam in the woods or are outside a lot, just washing your pets can keep them from spreading, as well as cleaning your shoes, especially if you go on a hike or on a work site. Cleaning your shoes, just tapping them or brushing them off would greatly help stopping the spread of invasive species.
In the way previously mentioned about the hemlock tree in Belgium, Invasive species can destroy habitats. These species can interfere with the ecosystem or take the resources of the species that's native to that area. These type of things can lead to death of plants or animals that are native. So if this continues happening, the native population can be threatened and possibly move towards extinction. Invasive species that cause deterioration or decrease viability of organisms can be a major issue. For example, agricultural, important economically. If crops are affected by invasive species, they can become damaged and no longer viable, which will decrease the amount of exports and cause a loss of money. So invasive species such as zebra mussels, which was mentioned, can have an economic impact. Zebra mussels clog water systems, and to be removed, it costs money. So these are some examples of the negative impacts that native species have, along with pollution, causing human health, and finally biodiversity, which we will talk about later.
So, invasive species negatively affect the economy. Worldwide, the invasive species do an estimate of $1.4 trillion in damages a year. And in the United States, they do $120 billion in damages a year. Some examples of the damages that they do in the United States are the black and Norway rats that do $19 million in damages a year. And what they do is they get into the live feed and the stock of rice. And then the leafy spurge in southern Manitoba that does $40.2 million in damages a year.
So what is biodiversity? It's a term in which is used to describe enormous variety of life. This can range from plants, bacteria, animals, and humans. Scientists have estimated that there are around 8.7 million species of plants and animals that exist, but there are only 1.2 million species that are described, in which most are insects. It can also be used to specify and refer all species to one region or ecosystem. Depending on the environment in which the plant lives in, there can be signs of an increased biodiversity from warm to wet and tropical areas. So the positive effects of biodiversity is that it boosts ecosystem and productivity to the point where no matter how small the species may be, they play an important role. Examples of positive effects of biodiversity is that if there are larger amounts of plant species present, there is a high chance of a variety of crops to be present as well. If a natural disaster occurs and damage to crops occur, or even lower population of the animals, a healthy ecosystem can recover and withstand to these events and not be highly affected from it. So how humans affect biodiversity is in a negative term. Humans affect biodiversity by causing major changes worldwide and harm biodiversity and ecosystem in the process of all of it. By causing a change to the ecosystem, it causes plants and animal communities to struggle to find other ways to adapt to the environment. Some examples in which humans affect biodiversity is destruction, degradation, and fragmentation of habitats. Reduction of survival and reproductive rates, which is caused by the pollution and an introduction of alien species.
So how do invasive species actually affect biodiversity? Just like Brittany said, invasive species are non-native to the environment from another environment. These species have minimal to no predators to keep balance within the environment. With not keeping balance in the environment, native species start to die off and move away from the environment that they are previously from. Which affects the environment tremendously, and the native species could result in extinction. The picture on the right is a lionfish. It is very common to be an invasive species. These lionfish have none to minimal predators for them, so they are the predator. They affect the coral reefs and marine ecosystem by 79%.
To add on to Nicholas' slides, and as Brittany said, 42% of endangered species are due to invasive species, and that's almost half. Invasive species can destroy the total ecosystem of a habitat and their food chains, like Nicholas said, because in most cases, invasive species don't have a direct predator that can limit their their amount. And invasive species can drastically alter habitat. So if they don't necessarily destroy habitat, they can alter it and change it in ways that wouldn't be possible if they weren't introduced to the habitat.
So climate change and biodiversity. Climate change is linked with biodiversity in a negative way and never in a positive way. Climate change is due to the loss of the food, shelter, and balance within the environment. For animals, this is usually because of a removal of one native species. And for humans, climate change affects millions of people's homes and resources across the world. You see more of this in poor areas rather than your average city and suburbs.
Okay, so what we can do to help biodiversity. A part of biodiversity is about encouraging healthy and favorable conditions for our local ecosystems so that organisms can have the chance to survive and thrive. There are aspects, of course, that we can't fix ourselves, but there is a lot that we can do to help locally. Buying from local farms can help support agriculture. Maintaining presence of plants that are native in our areas can help them from going extinct. Limiting water usage can help maintain good levels of water availability, and taking care of the environment, such as not stepping on plants or creating new trails when we go on hikes, can help save our local ecosystems. We learned that invasive species can have long-term major effects. So if we all do our parts, we can make a difference in conserving biodiversity.
To add on to our slides, another thing that we can do to help protect biodiversity and habitats are to protect endangered species by not introducing invasive species to them, and by not dropping off foreign animals to different habitats, because we've learned all throughout this PowerPoint that invasive species can destroy a habitat. And what happens a lot of times is people get animals and then they get tired of them or can no longer take care of them because they've gotten so big, and then they drop them off into a different habitat. Another thing that we can do is recycle and don't pollute, because pollution has effects with climate change and it's not good for the ecosystem in general. And then you can compost your leftover food. And something that you can do locally is stand up and protest for deforestation and other things that help destroy ecosystems.
Now that we understand the impacts of these invasive species, we can look at specific case studies and see how those species impacted that area in the past. This case study focuses on the Great Lakes in the United States. Invasive species can easily be introduced anywhere that great waterways connect. Therefore, the Great Lakes were a perfect entry for these species to come in because they connect to so many ports. Ships have ballast water stored, which helps them stabilize on the open water and oceans, but before there were precautions for these ships, they would fill their tank at the beginning of their journey and empty it at the end. This carried along all of the species from the different waters. About a decade ago, there was a ship that came from the Caspian Sea and dumped its water into the Great Lakes. The Eurasian zebra mussels were introduced. This organism threatened about 140 native mussel species, and this one species took all the resources, food, and living space that the native organisms already had. This made their living conditions very competitive. In addition to the Eurasian zebra mussels, many plant species have also been introduced by these ships and have become invasive. And examples of these include reedgrass, curly pondweed, cattail, and frogbit. In result to these invasive species, they had to pay billions of dollars in maintenance in order to clean the pipes of the dams and power plants. The cost of this was unfortunately also passed on to the consumers. Since then, many different programs have been created in order to stop the spread of these invasive species before they got too out of control. This tactic that they use for the Great Lakes is called Early Detection Rapid Response. The Great Lake Basin Monitoring Program is the biggest one currently, and it was created to test the species in lakes and treat them before they got out of control and invasive. Overall, the Great Lakes are still not exactly how they were before, but they have come a long way in the last 30 years.
And here are references at the end.